Welcome back to our conversations on race, faith, and community in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Grawemeyer Awards and as part of the Black Church Studies program at Louisville Seminary. We're just so glad you're here. I hope you were well fed and are enjoying the conversation. And it has been my absolute delight to be in theological and political conversation with Chris Doucot ever since then. He operates out of a Roman Catholic background and particularly out of the tradition of the Catholic Worker movement. And so I ask you, I am so excited to have him here in my community. I ask you to please welcome Chris Doucot.
Good afternoon, church. I would say how are ya, but that would give away where I am originally from. I like Kentucky. I was here as a college student over in Hazard County and Clay County, building houses with a group called Kentucky Mountain Housing. And the whole week, the foreman of the crew, a fellow they called Wolfman, because he had these big pork chop sideburns, he kept trying to tell me something, and I couldn't understand him. And by the end of the week, we pulled in a classmate of mine, a kid from New Jersey, figuring he could translate. And it turns out what he had been trying to tell me all week was, and apologies, folks who say this the way it's meant to be said, I guess, but he said, "Son, you got yourself a speech impediment." I don't know. I think he had a speech impediment. Well, before I go into my remarks, this is sort of a non sequitur, but there was something that you said, Barbara, that made me think. You used the word patriotic, and I'm often charged with not being a patriot. And it's frankly not something I recoil from because I have a hard time being the places I've stood where I've seen children dismembered by bombs dropped from our planes makes it hard for me to be patriotic. But then you mentioned patriarchy as well, and a light went off in my head and makes me want to ask folks to think about what would it be like to be matriotic instead of patriotic. So I didn't prepare remarks on that, but it's something I'm going to think about. So actually, Kentucky has a place in my heart in terms of how I got to be where I am. I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to be confessing. Now, Catholics, we usually confess to a priest in private, but I'm going to be confessing to you all in public because I think the stories I'm going to tell are going to be illustrative of a way in which perhaps we shouldn't be Christian, and maybe we could be Christian differently. And my story begins with an assignment when I was an undergrad at Holy Cross College up in Worcester, run by Jesuits. And I was assigned to write about the radical priest Daniel Berrigan. And I dialed 411. I think everybody in this crowd should know what 411 is, or was. I don't know if your students would know what it is. And I found Dan teaching at Berea College here in Kentucky. And I prefaced a question to Father Dan by asking if he was a contemporary of Jesus. And he cut me off. And he forever changed my life because he says, well, I am. Aren't you? Well, I was kind of like the Grand Inquisitor from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, right? Jesus was dead. I didn't believe in any meaningful way that the incarnation and the resurrection were ongoing, unfolding miracles. I saw them as isolated historical events, finite events, and they are not. Despite going to church weekly, sometimes daily, Jesus was dead to me. This Kairos moment with Father Dan was my introduction to a form of incarnational theology, which has since informed every aspect of my life. To be told in a matter-of-fact way that Jesus was my contemporary and to believe that he is the Christ is to seek him out so as to have an engaging, meaningful, living relationship with him. Concurrent with my introduction to Father Dan, I learned about the Catholic Worker movement and its overtly incarnational ethos. The Pope gave a shout-out to Dorothy Day in the Catholic Worker 2 weeks ago before Congress. Left a lot of people scratching their heads. Thomas Merton as well, another imported son of Kentucky, actually, right? Since I had been going to church and receiving the Eucharist and didn't know that Jesus and I were contemporaries, it dawned on me that I was looking for him in the wrong place. My Catholic upbringing told me that Jesus was to be found in bread and wine, sheltered in temples of mortar and stone. Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan were telling me that he was to be found living in temples of flesh and bone, most visibly those that society deems the least among us. It was at the Catholic Worker House of Hospitality in Worcester when I was 18 that I first started to get to know Jesus in any sort of meaningful way. The Catholic Worker is a lay community of Catholics and like-minded friends formed by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin in the Bowery of New York City during the Depression, 1933. Peter Morin often said that our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, and our mission is to perform the works of mercy on a daily basis and in a personal manner. Right? The works of mercy, both the spiritual ones like forgiveness and patience, and the corporal ones like feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless, are just straightforward instructions on how we are to love. When Jesus tells us to love our enemies and to love our neighbors as ourselves, he's not telling us to become romantically involved with them. He's not suggesting that we need to be everybody's friend, but he is saying that to love, we must feed people when they are hungry and shelter them when they are homeless. We need to comfort them when they are ill, and we need to participate in movements of liberation when people are oppressed. Catholic worker communities are located in many of the poorest neighborhoods in America. We are intentional communities attempting to practice nonviolence and active resistance to the violence of empire, and voluntary poverty and active resistance to the worship of wealth. Catholic worker communities typically share our homes and our food with our neighbors, attempting to take personal responsibility for our complicity in the oppressive structures of our society, while engaging in nonviolent direct action against the powers and principalities that oppress. For the last 23 years, my getting to know Jesus has been through living in the north end of Hartford, a place many folks refer to as the ghetto, lovingly by my neighbors, derisively by the people outside of our community. You say you're from Connecticut. I can't say I'm from Hartford, right? People don't even know where Hartford is because of the way I say it. But you say you're from Connecticut, and people get these visions of this really white, really wealthy place. And it is, except for Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, which are typically listed in the top 10 of the poorest cities in the nation. And there's scarcely a white person to be found in those communities. My family and I, when we moved into our neighborhood, we were the only white people for miles. We remain the only white people for miles. I made the mistake just a few moments ago during an interview to say that my neighborhood is segregated. It's not. My neighborhood is incredibly diverse, filled with folks from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, a variety of Caribbean nations, and in African-American folks. It's integrated, except for the white people. They left a long time ago, and they haven't come back. Getting to know Jesus, this is how non-white my neighborhood is. When I go for a bagel every Saturday morning, and oftentimes I take one of the kids from the neighborhood with me, just the experience of getting in a car is a new experience for a lot of the children. And on more than one occasion, dozens of occasions, a kid will say to me when we go to the bagel shop, one town over, 5 miles away, with a straight face, they say, "Chris, where'd all these white people come from?" All right. Seeking a relationship with Jesus has brought me to jail as an inmate. It has brought me to a half a dozen different war zones as a nonviolent resistor. And though I couldn't articulate it at the time, when I first walked into the Catholic Worker community in Worcester, I was heading to what some folks dismiss as the margins of society, to seek shalom, a right relationship with God, by seeking a right relationship with poor persons, with my supposed enemies, and with my wealth. Right? A right relationship with my wealth. I became a Catholic worker because I agree with James Cone that it is time for theology to leave its ivory tower and join the real issues which deal with dehumanization of blacks in America. He is right to declare that relevant theology can only arise when it is unreservedly identified with the suffering of the oppressed. If it is true that God dwells in each of us, we all have some understanding of God that extends beyond what we are told by those situated in the monastery, the seminary, or the academy. Gustavo Gutierrez stresses the central role of theology as critical reflection of praxis, which places the lived experience, especially the lived experiences of the oppressed, at the center of our understanding of God. Whereas experience forms consciousness, reflection on experience transforms consciousness into understanding. What follows is a reflection on my experience. It's my understanding of how oppression operates in America, and thus how it might be overcome by the work of liberation. I may have studied the Word of God at Yale and Holy Cross, very much places in the center of society, but while living in the margins, I have heard the voice of God speaking through the people I encounter every day. It is in the stories of these people that I have come to understand oppression. Maybe not in the same way that they do. I mean, I'm a straight white guy, but I have a different understanding of oppression because of the decades I've lived in solidarity with my neighbors. By declaring that human liberation is God's work of salvation in Jesus Christ, James Cone provides us with a critical insight into how we are to know God. Just as students of art history are able to gain knowledge of a particular artist by studying her work, so too are students of God's history, theologians, able to understand or gain knowledge of God by studying God's work. Human liberation. I believe this insight of Cone's is the most tangible, though not exclusive, way to gain intimate knowledge of God. Liberation history is a biography of God. And since God chooses to be in us, a rather precarious place to be, that history, that biography, is a biography of us as well. Right? We are simultaneously co-authors and participants in this still unfolding narrative of the life of God. Right? The miracles of the incarnation and the resurrection continue. I have come to know that Jesus is my contemporary by coming to know the people in my impoverished neighborhood. So, the following stories, again, it's in part confessional. Articulating them is the requisite first step in a penitential project that I must take as a Christian laden with privilege, seeking racial and economic justice. So one of the first people I met at the Catholic Worker, one of the first people I met, right? I'm new to glasses, and thank goodness. One of the first people I met was a young man named Kenny. He was about my age. And he had a wild mop of this woolly brown hair, gruff razor stubble, and a disarming smile despite missing his front teeth like he was 6 years old. He had been chronically homeless until he was welcomed at the Catholic Worker. He was also schizophrenic. With the zeal of a convert, I spent much of my free time at the Worker and with Kenny. In the middle of the semester, I invited him to have dinner with me at the main dining hall at Holy Cross. And as soon as we walked in the door, people were staring at him. And, in my pride at believing I was befriending one of the so-called least among us, I put myself at the center of the relationship with complete disregard for Kenny. He was clearly unwelcomed, and we made a hasty exit. For months, I was furious with my classmates. It took years for me to realize that I was the one at fault. An honest examination of my motives would have revealed that I was using Kenny to show off what a good Christian I was, loving the least among us. I was disturbingly guilty of pride. I probably still am, right? Uncle Mortimer from the Screw Tape Letters would have had a field day with me. 20 years later, during the genocide in Darfur, Sudan, I found myself in Kalma camp. There was 100,000 people in this camp, living in what were desert igloos. They were huts, maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground, that extended for miles. The huts were twigs woven together and covered in burlap and scraps of litter. It was 120 degrees outside, and stepping out of the Range Rover, it was like a punch in the gut. Right? The sweat was just pouring off of me. The only shade to be found in this desert was inside these huts. And that was the only thing in these huts, was shade. There was no food, there was no water, no pillows, no blankets, no books, no toys, just shade. This little old woman came up to me, and she was bent over. She walked with a stick, and by the time she got to me, my shirt was completely wet. And she took me by the hand, and she led me to her hut, and she motioned for me to go inside. And I did so. And I filled the entire space. So she sat outside in the sun, and we spoke through an interpreter. How often and in how many ways do white guys like me fill spaces displacing women and people of color along the way? Though I may have asked her name at the time, I'll confess that I have since forgotten it. And in forgetting it, I fear that what I have engaged in is a form of pornography that I'll explain later. My next experience took place again in Darfur with my then 12-year-old son, who used to complain about being poor because he compared himself with his suburban cousins. He didn't compare himself with our neighbors. After going to Darfur, he never saw himself as poor again. But we went this time to a camp called Derej Camp, which had only 12,000 people living in it. And this was an unauthorized camp. What happened during the genocide is after people's homes and villages were burned to the ground, after most of the men were killed and most of the women raped, they ran into the desert. And there was no forest to hide in. The only safety they could have was to gather as groups. These 12,000 souls stopped walking in the desert when they came to the African Union troops' barracks. And they figured they were going to stop right across the street from those barracks. And the proximity to those barracks along a main road that connected the airport in Niala to the town center of Niala, that visibility would offer them some modicum of protection. And so the government said that's an unauthorized camp and told the folks, you can't be there. The folks ignored the government. The aid agencies didn't ignore the government. The aid agencies, Doctors Without Borders, CARE, just all the different groups, they were told that if they went into this camp to provide latrines, to bring in food, to set up schools, that their workers would be arrested and the organization would be kicked out of the country. And so they were told, you can either help the 2 million people that are in these other camps that we authorize and ignore those folks, or you can leave. And so they ignored the people in this camp. Well, my son and I had the idea, it was going to be more people, to be honest with you, but one by one they sort of dropped out. So my son and I had the idea, inspired by the lunch counter demonstrations, actually, right? If you were to walk by those lunch counters and you just saw a bunch of folks eating lunch, you wouldn't see the violence that was inherent in the situation. It took the courage of the people that sat there and had the crap beat out of them to expose to the broader public the violence that was built into that system. We wanted to expose that violence, and so we went with $10,000 to buy food every day and bring it to the people in this camp, hoping to provoke the dictator into arresting us and deporting us, drawing attention to what was happening there. Ultimately, they just ignored us. They didn't ignore a reporter from my hometown paper, a photographer that caught up to us, who was taking photos of this and ended up being detained and tortured, unfortunately. On our last day in this camp, we witnessed the miracle of loaves and fishes, and we learned its true meaning. We had purchased 2 cows and had them slaughtered, and we brought the beef to the people that were on the edge of the camp. And so these were the people that would have just arrived in the last 48 hours. When we asked them what they had eaten the day before, they told us that they were not among the lucky ones, their words. You should have seen the look on my kid's face when these folks used the term lucky ones in describing people in this camp. They weren't among the lucky ones. It turned out that the lucky ones were those folks that had received a modest bag of nuts, sun-dried tomatoes, and dates that my son and I had been distributing that week. We were able to give away maybe 1,000 of these bags every day, and each bag was scarcely enough to provide a single person a single meal. So the people on the edge of the camp told us that, no, they were not among the lucky ones, but then they told us that the lucky ones had shared. After we had left the camp, to this day, I'll never get over this. After we had left the camp, these people reconnoitered and emptied these little brown paper bags and spread the food out more. That's loaves and fishes right there. It's not magic, right? Jesus didn't do magic, more fish, more bread. Jesus encouraged radical sharing, and it was enough to go around. My final story is about my friend Floyd. I met Floyd, a black man now in his mid-20s, when he was just a grade school kid who came to our place every day. Our place, the kids in the neighborhood call it the greenhouse because we painted it garishly green. And we never intended to work with children. We thought we would just be welcoming homeless folks with us and sharing food with folks. But we were open to doing what the neighborhood wanted, not what our agenda was. And it was kids. Kids just started coming to our place. Hey, do you have a dog? Can I take your dog for a walk? Hey, you got a pump for my bike? I got a flat. Well, then I need a wrench and a patch. And hey, that's a nice apple. You got an apple. I can't do my math. And kids just started coming. And I had 2 little kids, right? My sons are now 22 and 21. So it just, do math with 1 kid, you can do math with 2 kids. So Floyd was one of those kids, and he's now a grown man. He came for snack, help with his homework, time on our basketball court. Floyd spent a ton of time with us. At one point, he lived with us. Eventually, Floyd began to call me Dad, and a lot of kids do this, and I almost always tell them not to, especially when they have a dad at home, like Floyd did. Despite this, and despite a frustration-fueled falling out, Floyd still calls me Dad, and I still tell him not to, but he still calls me Dad. One day, we were having a conversation. I don't know what it was about, but in the midst of the conversation, I just made I don't know how it came up, but I revealed that Floyd received food stamps. Everybody gathered there received food stamps. I was eligible for food stamps, but that was beside the point. My insensitivity my assumptions, my arrogance, my disregard for Floyd's dignity really hurt him. And he reminds me of that every time we meet. He reminds me of that. He's forgiven me, but he hasn't forgotten me. Upon reflection, I draw several lessons from these interactions which I think can help inform white people seeking racial justice. From Kenny, I learned that the beloved community will not be found by persons on the margins going to the center. Rather, justice requires the privileged to move to the margins. Liberation is not about asking the oppressed to visit their oppressors in our halls of plenty. It is about abandoning halls of plenty in search of authentic relationships, reciprocal and right relationships. We must be pilgrims who journey to the margins, seeking a solidarity informed by what we see, by what we witness. Right? We're called to be Christian witnesses. What do we witness? When our gaze is turned away from the margin and back toward the center that we've deliberately left. Some in the center choose not to look at the margins at all. I guess they gaze in the mirror. Others engage in a sympathetic gaze from the center toward the margins, which can only see victims. Meanwhile, the view looking back from the margins while standing shoulder to shoulder with multidimensional persons, right? Real people, enfleshed people, subjects, not objects. It begins to reveal the outlines of oppression and how oppression works. When we see members of oppressed communities as victims first and proceed on a mission to rescue them individually, we repeat the sins of the past by robbing people of their agency and identity while reducing them to the raw materials of our salvation. When church groups come to our place wanting to do service or to do good, I hopefully gently chastise them that we don't want them to do good, that they're not coming to rescue anybody or to save anybody, maybe themselves. But we're not seeking any sort of saviors, any sort of savior complex. From Floyd and many others, I have learned that charity can be an occasion for sin. Of course, when people are hungry, we must respond to their immediate need and feed them. However, when charity is the sole component of a relationship, it is not possible for that relationship to be right. Through my relationship with Floyd, I learned that to beg for a God-given right, like food or shelter, is usually a humiliating experience. In fact, I have observed that the amount of humiliation experienced by the recipient in a charitable exchange is directly proportional to the pride of the giver. I believe this extends to the machinations of the welfare state, which is nothing more than bureaucratized, anonymized macro charity. A frequent gripe I hear in the neighborhood is that welfare programs and social service agencies seem to help their workers more than the people for whom the programs are intended. While it is true that caseworkers are not well paid from the perspective of those in the center, the view from my neighborhood, where most people don't have a car, asks, why do they get cars? And how come they get to leave the neighborhood before sundown? And how come they get a house in the suburbs? And why do their kids attend better schools? In this scenario, Floyd and my neighbors are the raw materials of the new economy, providing jobs for a small army of social workers and rehab counselors. Some in the neighborhood derisively dismiss these folks as poverty pimps. This is perhaps most disturbingly the case vis-a-vis the war on drugs and mass incarceration, where some communities now fight to have the prison in their community because it means jobs. right? And these prisons are often located in white communities, and the inmates in those prisons get counted in the census tract as residents of those communities, and those numbers are used in formula to determine state aid to different communities. And so you extract poor people of color from the city, move them to neighborhoods that are all white, and then you give them more state aid at the expense of the people in the neighborhood. Raw materials. The problem with charity is that it's not justice. Welfare and private charity leave untouched the oppressive systems of our society which impoverish and imprison. When we who have benefited from oppressive systems go on pilgrimage to stand with those who are oppressed, we will begin to see and hear, feel and smell their world. We will be confronted with our complicity. I am confronted with my complicity every day. The work of justice is the work of liberation. For communities on the margins, justice is liberation from the structural sins of our society that impede their full, dignified participation in creation. To work for justice, the privileged pilgrim must seek solidarity with the oppressed. This is not easily done from a distance, but it is an essential movement toward our being human. Letty Russell writes that the elites of society are also made less human by the structures of domination, exploitation, and dehumanization which they perpetuate. I've come to the city because I want to be human. I don't want to be diminished by my participation in oppression. James Cone writes, authentic liberation of self is attainable only in the context of an oppressed community in the struggle of freedom. Within the context of an oppressed community, the notion that the struggle for liberation, the struggle for food, shelter, education, and freedom involves work in the here and now is self-evident. Thus, while fellowship with God is the beginning and the end of human liberation, it is a fellowship grounded in the historical struggle to be free. To be thus grounded involves participation in social movements for freedom, in fellowship with sisters and brothers, in ways that transcend race, class, gender, geography, and generation. We are called by the God of justice, in the voices of the oppressed, to go on a pilgrimage seeking solidarity in order to find shalom, that is, right relationships. An exegesis of the story of the rich young man reveals that it is a story of right relationships. In the story, the rich young man asks Jesus what he must do to be a disciple, to which Jesus tells him to follow the commandments. Right? We know the story. When the man replies that he has, a rightfully skeptical Jesus instructs him to sell all that he has and give the proceeds to the poor. Of course, we know he went away sad. For as Ambrose and Basil asked, or is it Basil? I never know, right? One's the herb, one's the guy. For as Ambrose and Basil asked back in the 4th century, how could the man have followed the commandment to love his neighbor as himself and still remain rich? If it were true, which the rich young man affirmed, that he has obeyed the commandment of love from youth and has given to everyone as much as he has to himself, whence, I ask, has he all this wealth? For the care of the poor consumes wealth. Hence, whoever loves the neighbor as oneself will possess no more than one's neighbor. Close quote. Ultimately, the rich man goes away from Jesus sad. Because he is unwilling to have a right relationship with his wealth, he is unable to have a right relationship with his poor neighbors, and he has thus prevented himself from having a right relationship with Jesus. The people I met in Darfur showed me what a right relationship with wealth looks like. When the elderly woman gave me a bit of her shade to relieve my suffering, I initially thought she had given me everything she owned. But how does one own the shade? Of course, she didn't own the shade, but she did possess it. And there's a distinction lost on so many of us. Likewise, the lucky ones who shared the meager portions we had provided recognized that they didn't own the food in their possession. It was only a matter of circumstance that they were among the lucky ones to begin with. The food they shared was not from them, but through them. You could say it was from me, but I had it because I had begged for it from my friends and family before I had left. So it was likewise not from me, but only through me. Ambrose expanded on this point, writing, "Not from your own do you bestow upon the poor man, but you make return from what is his. For what has been given as common for the use of all, you have appropriated to yourself alone. The earth belongs to all, not to the rich. Everything belongs to God, who orders everything to be shared with those who are in need. This is justice, that one restore to the needy, because it is God who gives." This reorientation with wealth also serves to mute the pride of the giver by causing us to acknowledge that we are merely God's middlemen and middlewomen in any charitable transaction. With our pride in check, hopefully the potential humiliation of the beggar will likewise be checked, as the beggar is no longer some anonymous victim, but a co-laborer in the vineyard of justice. In America, seeking a right relationship with wealth in our possession is inextricably bound to the work for racial justice. The 21-to-1 white-black wealth disparity in America, right? The median wealth of white folks is 21 times that of black folks, is the result of centuries of deliberate policies written to enrich white Americans while also impoverishing non-white Americans. And this gets to what Dr. Jennings Willie Jennings was talking about. From the Homestead Act and the Indian Removal Act, which took land from the indigenous people of America and gave it to whites, to the FHA of the New Deal, which virtually created a white middle class by subsidizing home ownership while denying participation to non-whites, to regressive tax policies that result in low-income Americans paying a higher overall tax rate than the middle class or the wealthy. The root of wealth and thus poverty in America is unjust, and it is racist. The FHA, here's how the FHA works in real terms. When the Great Migrations happened after the two world wars, black folks came up north, and in Hartford, they moved to the neighborhood that I live in, and the white people left. And the white people were moving to the newly created suburbs that were subsidized by the federal government with these FHA-backed mortgages. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of mortgages. 98% of it went to white folks. Right? The people moving into my neighborhood, they couldn't get those mortgages. They became renters. Right? They paid rent that was used by the former owner of the home to pay a mortgage. Here's how that plays out in real time in this allegedly post-racial America. Right? My son. So my dad is a very hard-working fellow, but it's not his hard work that led to his generous gift to me a few years back. My dad was a welder. My dad is illiterate. My dad lived in a housing project as a child and was homeless for a while. And a baker took him in, and a baker gave him a job. I'm guessing if my dad was black, the baker, 1950s America, let's be generous and say he would give him the job. He's not letting my dad live in the bakery as well. But anyways, he introduces my dad to another Italian-American business owner that is a welder and hooks up my dad with a job for life. And with this job and with his whiteness, my dad purchases a home with an FHA-backed mortgage outside of Boston. He purchased the home in 1980 for about $80,000. And a few years ago, he sold his home for what I think is just an unfathomable amount of money. He sold it for $250,000. Rich is beyond our imagination growing up. And so my dad, right, thinks he got this because he worked hard. And it is. partially true. He worked hard. He had to make the mortgage payments, but it's because he's white that he got the mortgage to begin with. And so he gave me 5,000 of those dollars, which I gave to my son, who was 18 at the time, which he used to buy a car, which then enabled him to look for a job anywhere he wanted, and work a schedule whenever he wanted. His friends in the neighborhood, their grandparents, after 30 years, didn't sell a home. They had a shoebox full of rent receipts. They didn't get $5,000 to buy a car. Their jobs have to be on the bus line. The hours they work have to coincide with the bus schedule. Does it make my son a racist? No. Does it mean that my son has privilege from his race? Absolutely. The kids in my neighborhood live in buildings where the landlord has spray painted on the front door, no loitering, no trespassing, police take notice, tenants included. So kids in my neighborhood are routinely hassled and frisked by the police for sitting on their own front stoop, because that's not the space that their family is renting. They're renting the apartment. And if you're not in your apartment, you're trespassing. And if you're on the corner, you're loitering. And so the kids in my neighborhood are frisked all the time for loitering and trespassing. Now, sometimes the kids in my neighborhood have reefer in their pocket. Sometimes kids in the suburbs have reefer in their pocket, but they're not frisked. They smoke it on their back porches or in their family rooms. The police aren't going to invade those private spaces. Now, the kid in my neighborhood gets arrested because he's got reefer and he's trespassing. Well, by virtue of living in the city, you're in a drug-free school zone because it's so densely populated. So now he has 3 charges. This is all related to the FHA. This is a generation ago, right? The cascading effects of that racial injustice are going to be felt for generations to come. If the Christian of privilege is to avoid the fate of the rich young man who parted company with Jesus in sadness, then we must go on a penitential pilgrimage, seeking shalom with those who have been oppressed by the systems that have privileged us. In this regard, I think the work of Paulo Freire, Gustavo Gutierrez, Letty Russell, James Cone, Dolores Williams, and Patricia Hill Collins coalesce. In her writings on black feminist epistemology, Collins argues that what we know cannot be separated from how we know. She argues that what we know is incomplete because how we know has uncritically accepted as objective that portion of knowledge discerned largely by straight, white, non-poor, and typically Christian men. It's not seen as a perspective, it is seen as the perspective. I do this exercise with my students where I have one student stand in the middle of the room with a box that has 4 pictures that each tell the same story slightly differently. And I have people stand in the 4 corners of the room and they tell me what they see. I make sure one corner of the room has a straight white guy. And so they all tell me what they see. And so then I said, well, who's telling the truth? You're all looking at the same thing and you're telling me 4 different things. And it's an obvious thing, right? They say, well, they are all telling a different piece of the truth. And I said, well, what if we just said that what the white guy said is the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth? And that what those other 3 folks are reporting from their perspectives, from their specific places, is also a part of the truth. How do we get away with not acknowledging that portion of the truth? That's what we do. Right? Collins doesn't argue that the knowledge gained from studying these men is wrong. It's just incomplete. Because they come from privileged places in society, their perspective isn't presented as a perspective, but again, as the only relevant perspective. The discourses shaping our understanding of what is good, moral, right, and normal are derivative of privilege. The dominant discourses work to protect privilege by disregarding the discourses of the oppressed. To speak, think, pray, celebrate, mourn, hear, dialogue, and live with people inhabiting the margins of society are, accordingly, subversive acts. Subversive acts along the margins of society are actually liberating acts. They are rightly the work of prophets. This point brings to mind a point made by Daniel Berrigan's brother Philip, who observed that the poor tell us who we are, the prophets tell us who we could be, which is why we kill the prophets and hide the poor. Collins, like Russell, Gutierrez, and Cone, argues that knowledge itself needs to be grounded in the lived experience and advanced through dialogue. The lived experience of black Americans is not that of white Americans, right? Newsflash. This is unfortunately not obvious to most white Americans living in our very segregated society. I see this most clearly when it comes to policing. When black Americans speak the truth about their experience with the police, white Americans typically don't get it. Right? And to think about how discourse operates, if a black guy walked into a white barber shop and said he was just pulled over by the police and it was racist, that experience is not going to be validated because it's not part of the dominant discourse. Whereas if he walks into the black barber shop, it's going to be validated by the experiences of every other black man in the shop. And that's a subversive discourse that needs to be heard and needs to challenge the dominant discourse, right? So from a white perspective, I hear this from my white family all the time and from my white brother who's a cop, that if you get the attention of the police, you must have done something wrong. Because that's the only time we get the attention of the police is when we roll through a stop sign or we speed. And living where I've lived, I know that that's just not true. I know that one of the things we do is we have a bike shop, and we fix up bikes, and we teach kids how to fix up bikes, and everybody gets a bike. And 3 of our kids, Catherine, Josh, and Seishan, who are riding their bikes in downtown, which is really just a suburban enclave, right? It's a suburban oasis. And they didn't belong there because they're not white, and they're not middle class. They're poor, they're brown, and they're black. And so they're riding their bikes, and the police pulled them over, put them in handcuffs, and put them on the curb for 45 minutes for full public display while the police ascertained whether or not the bikes were stolen. That's not an experience white people will ever have. It's not an experience I would have ever heard if I weren't friends with these kids. When we elevate our lived experience, the white lived experience, and universalize it, we unconsciously ask ourselves, again, what did the black man do to warrant police attention? Collins maintains that this way of knowing reinforces what she calls a matrix of domination, which is the superstructure that underpins all forms of domination and subordination in our society, such as racism and patriarchy. Moreover, she argues that segregation reproduces this way of knowing because white folks can easily avoid seeing the oppression that produces our privilege. It is awfully hard to be a Christian witness for justice when we place ourselves in locations that obstruct our view of injustice. To overcome this, Collins maintains that we must pivot the center of our being. Not deny our identity or denigrate our culture, but acknowledge that our center is not everyone's center. To get a fuller understanding of the truth, we need to pivot our center. If I can take the liberty of reading a quote from her. She writes, "The existence of black feminist thought suggests another alternative to the ostensibly objective norms of science and to relativism's claims that groups with competing knowledge claims are equal. This approach to Afrocentric feminist thought allows African American women to bring a black woman's standpoint to a larger epistemological dialogue concerning the nature of the matrix of domination. Eventually, such dialogues may get us to a point at which, claims Elsa Barkley Brown, all people can learn to center in another experience, validate it, and judge it by its own standards without need of comparison or need to adopt that framework as their own." The guys in the white barbershop don't need to deny their experience to validate the experience of the black guy that comes in to say he's just been harassed by the police. In such dialogues, one has no need to decenter anyone in order to center someone else. One has only to constantly, appropriately pivot the center. I believe that this pivoting is the beginning stage of what Freire calls the process of, I'm not going to say this right, conscientization. The critical next step in this process is praxis, that is, a hermeneutic of action and reflection based on a dialogue between equals. Obviously, this equality doesn't exist when those engaged in the dialogue include members of both the oppressed and oppressing parties. For these reasons, and because of the history of white and middle-class flight, I believe it is the responsibility of non-poor whites to take responsibility for their privileges and move to the margins to ground the pivoting of their Sinta in the lived reality that our privilege produces. If this seems like a penitential process for the privileged pilgrim, then maybe this moving away from class and race comfort is part of the penance we need to make on the road to racial justice and perhaps eventual racial reconciliation. Patricia Hill Collins makes the point that as children we have no choice in where we live, and thus with whom we become friends, but she questions why, as adults, do we repeat those patterns of segregation? This is especially so for people of privilege. Why do people of economic means choose to sequester themselves? Right? I guess what I'm asking is why can't we undo urban renewal, often called urban removal, where we had what were called vertically integrated neighborhoods, where in Hartford we have Aetna Insurance Company, where the vice president of Aetna lived in the same block as the janitor of Aetna, and their kids prayed at the same churches, played on the same Little League team, they shopped at the same stores, and they played in the same parks, and they knew each other. How come we can't have that anymore? Right? Why do we choose to reproduce that? Right? At our worst, we have made the poor, we, the privileged white we have made the poor, the oppressed, the infirmed, the other, on the margins of society disappear by avoiding any meaningful contact with them. Maybe sometimes concerned people of privilege only see victims at a distance and may seek to save or rescue them. I believe this is the most pervasive form of pornography today. To illustrate this point, just think about the late-night infomercials featuring the white American actress Sally Struthers holding an anonymous, swollen-bellied, half-naked African child as she appeals to you for a charitable donation. You know her name, you know her story. She's a person. The child is anonymous. The child is an object. In this scenario, the gaze is not one of lust, but of pity. But nonetheless, it is a gaze upon an object stripped of its dignity, identity, and humanity. In systems of privilege, members of the privileged class tend to be blind to our privilege and the systems that produce it. While the oblivious Christian is blind to their complicity, and the Christian missionary gazes through their complicity, the Christian witness acknowledges their complicity, because in the movement away from privileged spaces, they begin to see the world as it is for maybe the first time. To be a Christian is to seek solidarity rather than accept privilege without question. To be a Christian witness to race, white Christians must become pilgrims and stand, if not live, in places where they can see how race oppresses in the daily lives of people they care about. In this movement to the margins, white Christians must proceed in humility. We imitate Christ best through discipleship and not at all as wannabe messiahs. Discipleship is grounded in shared spaces and shared experiences from which liberating partnerships are forged. Poverty, patriarchy, racial oppression are the vestigial remnants of a bygone world. They are stubborn stains representing the persistent not yetness of God's reign. The conscious effort to seek solidarity rather than privilege, community rather than rugged individualism, cooperation rather than competition, dialogue rather than debate, to share rather than accumulate, to yearn for humility rather than bask in pride, are elements of perhaps something we could call proleptic living. Living these values diminishes the not yetness of the kingdom. To live these values is to embrace Christ among us and thus reveal that portion of the kingdom that is already in our midst. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're not very good at it, but that's what we're trying to do. Thank you for your time.